In this lesson, we're going to create a class for game items, a subclass for weapons, and a factory class to create the game items. We'll start by opening the solution. In the models folder of the engine project, we'll add a new class called game item. Because we're going to use the game items in other projects, we'll make this class public. And we'll add 3 properties that we're going to use in all the game items. In this case, it's going to be a public integer property that we call item type ID. And we'll add the getter and setter for that. We'll add a public string property called name with a get and a set. And a public int property called price with a get and a set. For this class, we're also going to add a constructor. So we'll create public game item, and this function will be called when we instantiate a new game item object. We'll also add 3 parameters so we can set the value of the properties when we create the new object. And this will be int item type ID, string name, and int price. If you notice, the parameter names all match with the property names. Except for the property names, the first character is uppercase, and the parameter name, the first character is lowercase. So for C#, those are 2 different variables, 2 different things. What we need to do is get the values from the parameters and set the property to those values. So inside the constructor, we'll say item type ID with a capital I for the property equals item type ID with a lowercase I for the parameter. So we'll instantiate a game item object, pass in the item type ID, and this line, line 17, will take the parameter and set the property to its value. And we'll do the same thing for the name and for the price. This is the method we're going to use to set the property values on the game item objects. And a quick note here, you do not have to make the parameter name match the property name except for the different cases, but this is a common way that C# programmers work. Next, we're going to create a weapon class. Every object in the game is going to be a game item object, but some of them will have some extra information. For example, a weapon will have the amount of damage that it does. So we're going to create a subclass of the game item class that will have the extra information. So in the engine project, in the models, I'll create another class that we'll call weapon. We'll make this public, and we'll signify that this is a subclass of game item by changing the line public class weapon. We're going to add a colon and then game item after that. So that says the weapon class is a subclass of game item. And if you notice, there's some red squiggly lines under it because we have an error right now. When we hover over it, it says the base class game item doesn't contain a parameterless constructor. So in order to construct a game item object, we need to have a constructor that takes these parameters. So I'm going to create a constructor for the weapon class that takes the same parameters as the game item class. I'm just going to go and copy this so I can paste it in quickly and go back to the weapon class, say public weapon, give it the same parameters, and then type space colon space and base, open parentheses, and then put in the 3 parameters, the item type ID, the name, and the price. And then I'll put the open and close curly braces for the constructor method. What this will do is when we instantiate a weapon object, we'll pass in these 3 parameters, item type ID, name, and price, and then it's going to take the values that we passed in and send them to the base class, in this case the game item. And it's going to pass in the item type ID, the name, and the price, which will set the properties. We also want to add two new properties to the weapon class, and this will be public int minimum damage with a get and a set, and public int maximum damage with a get and a set. Now we need to change the weapon constructor to take these values in as parameters. So I'll add two new parameters, int min damage and int max damage. And then I'm just going to put a return in here because our line's starting to get a little long. And now, just like in the game item, when we take the parameters and we set the property values, in the weapon class, we're going to set the minimum damage property equal to the min damage parameter, and the maximum damage property equal to the max damage parameter. So when we create a new weapon object, we'll be passing in the 5 parameters: item type ID, name, price, min damage, and max damage. The item type ID, name, and price, those parameter values will be passed to the base class, the game item class, so it can set the properties that are in the base class. And then the 2 additional parameters we're going to use to set the 2 new properties in the weapon class. And the third thing we're going to do is create the item factory. So we'll go to the engine project. In our factories folder, I'll right click on that, say add class, and create item factory. I'm going to make this class a public static class. It's static because we're not going to instantiate it. We're just going to use the functions in it, just like we did with our world factory class. And for the game items, we're going to do things a little bit differently. In this case, what I want to do is create a variable that holds all the items in the world. And then whenever the game needs to create an item, so it needs to create a rusty sword or a health potion or something like that, it's going to call the factory and say, find me the rusty sword object and make me a new rusty sword object. In order to hold all of these game item objects, we need to have a collection. And in this case, we're going to use a collection that's called a list. I could create a class level variable here. I'll make a private static variable, and it's static because this is a static class and it's going to have static methods. So our class level variables also have to be static. And I could create a game item data type variable that I would call game item. The problem is this would only hold one game item, and we want to have all the game items. We want to have a collection of these. So we're going to change the data type to list and have a less than before game item and a greater than. What this means is game item would be a collection or a list of game items. So we can have no items in that list, we could have 1 item, we could have 1,000 items. It all depends on what we actually add to it based on our game requirements. And because this is going to hold a list of all the standard game items, I'm going to change the variable name to underscore standard game items. That's a little bit clearer so that we know what the variable is actually holding. Now we need a way to populate this list with all the items that are going to be in the game. A static class does not have a constructor because we never create an instance of a static class. We never create an object. It never really gets constructed. But it does have a function that we can say the first time anyone ever uses anything in this item factory class, run this function. And that's going to load up our list of game items. The way you create that function is you say static and then the class name, item factory, and then have the open curly braces and close curly braces for the function. So the first time anyone uses anything in this item factory class, this function is going to run. And this is what we're going to use to populate the standard game items list. Right now we're just going to do this with some hard-coded variables, but in the future we could expand this to actually load the items from a database or from an XML file or some other file. Before we can add anything to this list, we have to initialize it. And we'll do that by saying underscore standard game items equals new list game item, and then open parenthesis, close parenthesis. What this will do is it will create a new list of game items. It will be an empty list. It doesn't have any items in it yet, but then it will assign that list to the variable. If we didn't do this, then the standard game items variable would be null. It would be nothing. And we can't add objects to nothing. We have to add it to an empty list. And this is how we get the empty list. Now I'll add a couple of items into there. And the way we do that is by saying the variable name dot add, because a list understands we want to add things to it, we want to remove things from it, we want to find things in the list, we want to count what's in the list. Add is one of the functions that's available to a list variable. And we're going to add a new weapon, and its ID is 1001. It's a pointy stick. It has a price of 1, a minimum damage of 1, and a maximum damage of 2. And we have another line here to add a rusty sword weapon to the game item list. For right now, this is all we'll add to the list just so we can get started. Now we need to add a function to the item factory to actually get objects from our list. And we'll do that by creating a public static function that's going to return a game item, and we'll name it create game item. And for the parameter, we're going to pass in an integer that we call item type ID. And this item type ID is going to be what we pass in to find the matching item inside the standard game items list. We could do that by using a for each loop that would look at each item inside the list. But when you have a list variable, there are some cool features you can use. One is called link. It's kind of a query language that we can run to see what's inside of a list. What I'll do is create a new variable. Its data type will be game item, and I'll name it standard item, and I'll say it's equal to underscore standard game items dot first or default, and then I'll say item equal sign greater than sign item dot, and you see we've got the item properties, so I'll choose item type ID double equals, and I'm going to put item type ID and a semicolon at the end of the line. So what this will do is on the standard game items list variable, it's going to use link to find the first item that has an item type ID property value that matches the item type ID we passed into the function. Because we're using first or default, if it doesn't find an item that matches this condition, it's going to use the default value, which in this case is going to be null. So this standard item variable is either going to have the item from our standard game items that matches, or it's going to have a null in it. And what I want to do now is actually create a copy of that object. This standard item is going to be kind of the default starting value for an object, but for this version of the game, we're going to have the ability to modify objects. So we could create a pointy stick, and maybe in the future you can add gems to it or enchant it, and you could have two different pointy sticks. One's going to have certain enchantments, and the other one will have different enchantments. So we want to have unique pointy stick objects. In order to do this, we need to have unique individual objects. So we're going to create a copy of the standard item. So I'll add a few lines here that says if standard item not equal to null. Now we need a way for these standard objects to create a copy of themselves. This is normally called cloning, where you make another new object that has the exact same property values as a different object. And the way we're going to do that is by going into the game item and the weapon class and adding a new clone function. This will be a public function, and it's going to return, for the game item class, it will return a game item. And we'll call it clone. And this will say return new game item. And for the parameter values, we're going to pass in the existing property values. Item type ID, name, and price. So if we have a game item object and we call the clone function, it's going to instantiate a new game item, and the parameters it's going to pass into the constructor for the new game item will be the same property values that it has. So that's how it creates the clone. We'll do the same thing for the weapon class. Public weapon clone. And this will say return new weapon, and we'll pass in the item type ID, the name, the price, the minimum damage, and the maximum damage. So if you call the clone function on a weapon object, it's going to instantiate a new weapon, take its property values, pass those in as a parameter for the constructor of the new object, and that's how the new object will have the exact same values as the old object. But if you notice under the clone function, there's some squiggly lines. We've got a problem we need to look at. If we hover over it, it says weapon clone hides inherited member game item clone. Since the weapon class is a subclass of game item, all of the game item's properties and functions are available to the weapon class, but we have two functions with the exact same name. Weapon has a clone function, and game item has a clone function. That's where the problem is. What we can do to solve it, if we hover over it, it says the keyword new is required on clone because it hides the method game item clone. So what I would need to do here in the weapon class is say public new weapon clone. And this basically says if we call the clone method on a weapon object, we want to override the one in the game item. So now our weapon class has a clone function to make a copy of itself, and our game item class has a clone function to make a copy of itself. We can go back to the item factory now, and we're going to say if the standard item is not null, so if we did find an object that matched, we're going to say return standard item dot clone, which will say take the standard item, make a copy of it, and return that from this create game item function. And we need to do one more thing. We need to handle if the standard item is null, and in that case I'm going to say return null. And now we have everything ready to actually start creating game item objects. Just for a quick overview, we've got this item factory. It has this list of standard game items, which can hold no game items, one game item, thousands of game items. The first time anyone ever calls a function in item factory, this static item factory function will run, which will initialize the list with an empty list, and then start adding some items to it, in this case 2 weapons. And in the game, when we actually start creating game item objects to be used, like treasure that's on a monster or items in the player's inventory, we're going to use this create game item function to actually create those objects. We'll pass in the ID type. If we find an item that matches the ID type, we will create a copy of it and return that. If we don't find an item, we're going to return nothing. The way we're going to write the code, this should never return a null object, but we need to have this in there just in case that ever happens. I'll include a link in the description of this video to the text version of the video that also has all the source code if you want to just copy and paste it from there and not worry about mistyping something. And if you have any questions about something, you can leave a comment there on the support page, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible.